The Gateway Arch, an illustrated timeline. That's next on City Corner. I'm Steve Potter, and welcome to City Corner. Well, John C. Guenther is a lifelong St. Louisan, and we welcome him to City Corner. John, nice to meet you.
Thank you. Great to meet you as well.
And you are one of those people that have been here your whole life.
Born and raised.
And what says St. Louis more than the Gateway Arch, I wonder?
It is truly iconic and known worldwide, and certainly a wonderful landmark here in our town.
Yeah, and of course, what do you remember? I'm just curious. What's your earliest memories of it? Do you remember it being built?
I remember seeing it go up, but I was younger in those days, so at any rate, it was just great to see its completion, and I'm always deeply moved every time I drive by and look over.
Is it just me? To me, it still seems so modern. Now, it opened in 1965, right?
It was topped out in 1965,
right.
Yes.
That was a long time ago. But when I see it now, it looks like something from the future.
Absolutely. It is truly timeless, of its time, and yet very timeless and very future-oriented, very modern, minimalist and sculptural and amazing design and structural engineering. So truly a marvel.
And what made you want to write a book about this?
Well, I've growing up here in St. Louis, I've long admired it. I've also taught a class at Washington University on mid-century modern architecture, and we would take our students out of the classroom and to various iconic mid-century structures. And the very first class we would go would be to the Arch.
Right. Now, you're an architect by trade?
Yes, I am. Yes.
You know, I was trying to think, this is going to sound silly, but I thought, what is an architect really? Because to me, it's sort of a cross between science and art. So can you explain it to me?
Well, architecture is the art of science and...
then I was right.
You're right. Yes, of art and design and science. And so it combines both halves of the brain. and so it's a wonderful profession. It's one that allows you to expand your imagination, think about what is and what could be, ask why and why not, and how you might be able to improve our world somehow.
So in your career, have you designed buildings and things like that?
I have. My largest building to date that I had the privilege of designing was the Chaffetz Arena for St. Louis University.
You're kidding.
10,600 seats. The very green building that I had the privilege of designing, the Alberici headquarters at Page and 170. And a notable one that's in my heart is the South Entrance Plaza to the St. Louis Zoo, with the plaza and the train tunnel and the waterfall. So it always is wonderful to see that and see families taking photographs of their memories there.
I wonder if I can afford to have you design a house for me.
It would be fun. Let's talk.
We'll talk after this. John, the name of your book is The Gateway Arch, an illustrated timeline. And what you're really looking at, I think, is what led up to the arch, not just when they broke ground for it, but the things that happened in history over, I guess, ever since humankind landed or lived in St. Louis.
Yes, it is 90 historic events that led to the creation of the Gateway Arch. We do begin in 1699 with the Louisiana Territory and then move on to the Louisiana Purchase. When one thinks about the Jefferson National Expansion Memorial and what the memorial was intended to honor, we think about the expansion of our country, the doubling of its size with the Louisiana Purchase, and so on. But to be sure, when the European settlers came through and came down the river, we were known as the Mound City because of the Mississippian culture that had been here long before us.
Right, the mounds of which there are, I guess, one or two left, right?
Well, most of them have. There is one or two left, and the great mounds over in Cahokia are really to be seen and taken in. Yes.
Well, let's look at a couple of images from your book and get things going, and it's filled with fabulous pictures and images.
Yes.
And I've seen this one before, one similar to it. I can never get this one out of my mind.
Yes. Here we are at the top of the arch, and it's been completed here. And you can see the workmen. The crane is still in the background there, so it's still up there waiting to climb back down again. It was a creeper derrick, and it was used. It rose up with each section to hoist each can into the place. But at any rate, they are polishing and cleaning the stainless steel outer surface on their way back down.
Did they get paid extra?
Not that I know of, but
I just have I have a widow's walk on the top of my third floor, and I can't stand on that without my knees getting weak and queasy. I can't imagine what it would be like to stand on top of the arch.
and without being tied off. That is truly remarkable. In fact, they didn't want to be tied off. It was pre-OSHA, so they weren't required, but they didn't want to because it would be more cumbersome. But truly very courageous and very talented and skillful workers. And it should be noted, while the insurance actuarials thought they might lose 13 or so men in the construction, no one died.
Wow. There was that time, remember when the guy threw his plane through?
Yes.
Threw the plane through and got in trouble?
Yes.
That's not in the book, though.
No, not in the book.
Let's look at another image here. What's this?
So this is the historic riverfront, obviously pre-arch grounds, and this is...
It was pretty kind of an industrial warehouse area, right?
It was, and really was the economic engine of St. Louis. And you can see the riverboats on the landing, but here you have about 37 blocks of what would become the Gateway Arch, and every building, it's party wall to party wall. So I wrote the introduction to the Lost St. Louis Riverfront by Tom Grady, and in it I refer to it as form follows lot. So if they had a building width that could be a certain dimension, they built side to side and as tall as they could. But what they did was they left the front side, the street side, as open as possible, and the alley side for the receiving of goods, fresh air and ventilation, and so on. And actually, there was a quite sophisticated architecture that developed on our riverfront with cast iron fronts that are the precursors to the Chicago-style high-rises.
And there was a lot of controversy, wasn't there, about demolishing that area? I mean, that was not an easy sell.
It was not an easy sell. There was a vote by the public to go forward, but also a lot of landowners were protesting and really did not want to see their properties sold and torn down for the development. So,
let's look at another image from the book.
Yes, the Eads Bridge.
You mentioned the Eads Bridge in there, and there's even a photograph of the Eads Bridge with the arch, and you make some kind of connection, even though they're far apart in history, they're both significant.
1874, and every bit as dramatic of a structural marvel as the Gateway Arch.
We don't think of it now, but then it was.
Absolutely. And to think that they were making this large clear span across the Mississippi, and you might even think of this as the first gateway to the West, physically and literally, because the trains prior to this would be dismantled, put on barges, shipped across the river, and then reassembled to go further west. So now trains could go from the east to the west with this construction, but truly an engineering marvel.
Let's look at the next one.
The topping out of the Gateway Arch.
See, I remember that because we were living in New Jersey at the time, and I remember leaving in the summer of 1965. There was a little more opening than this, but I remember driving through downtown on our trip home. I'll never get that image out of my mind.
Right. Yeah, so this was October 28th of 1965 when the last piece was set. And they began the lift in the morning, and it was set in place just a little after 11 in the morning. And the legs, as you can imagine, the forces, the pressure leaning inward, there was just about a 2-foot wide gap for an 8-foot wide section of the final section. So they had jacks that pushed the legs apart to 8.5 feet wide, set that 8-foot section in, and then they released the jacks and it was locked into place. But there was 1/64th of an inch tolerance to get this all to work out. So.
John, you say something in your book about architecture reflecting society's values and things. What do you mean by that?
Well, it represents our hopes and aspirations. It represents the times we live in. And as we say, this is a very timeless piece of architecture, but it's certainly of its time. And even when you think about, would they ever tear the riverfront down as we know it, as it existed, if that were our decision today? Probably not. We value our historic architecture more these days. But that being said, that decision was made, and thank goodness we received this wonderful design by Eero Saarinen.
And all kind of, wasn't in the 1930s the idea first started floating around?
Yeah.
And I'm just curious, were there people, the arch looked so modern, were there a lot of people that thought it was too modern for an old city? It wouldn't look right?
I don't believe so. And what's interesting is the span of time it took. So the idea began in 1933 with Luther Eli Smith, an attorney and a civic booster and leader.
But they weren't thinking the arch.
No,
What were
had
they
no
thinking?
idea about the arch at the time. He was just a memorial to honor Thomas Jefferson and those who went forth from here
Right.
out to the west. And so that was the idea. And it wasn't until 1947 that the competition happened. So there was quite a bit of a span of 14 years or so in between. And I will go back to the removal of those historic buildings on the riverfront. It's one thing to tear those down if you know you're going to get something as beautiful as the Gateway Arch, but nobody knew what they were going to get when they tore those buildings down, and the competition requirements were still being formulated. Yeah.
Let's look at another image from the book. That's the man himself.
There he is, Eros Saarinen, and here is a model of the Gateway Arch and the riverfront as designed. Ultimately, this is the final version, and you can see it's up further away from the river, from the levee, with the grand stairs leading down and the beautiful landscape by Dan Colley surrounding it. What's interesting about this is that, well, first of all, Eero Saarinen he trusted his eye, and he had models made of everything. And even if there were mathematical formulas that he was thinking about and analyzing, he didn't trust it until he saw it physically. And so this is a 630 foot tall by 630 foot wide, flattened catenary arch. He actually pushed down on it to give it a more rounded top. Mm-hmm. But what's fascinating about this photograph in particular, you see in front of Eero Saarinen, there are 3 vertical slabs of buildings just in front of him. That is the Mansion House. And what's interesting, when we talk about architecture and society and how it reflects society and how architecture interacts with the built environment, the design for the Mansion House originally was 2 40-story towers. And that caught everybody's attention, Eero Saarinen, the city, and they felt that was going to compete with the arch too much. And therefore, the city came back and said, we need to limit to the new buildings to 27 stories. So that's why we have 3 towers at Mansion House at 27 and instead of 2 40-story towers. And also, Eero Saarinen said, I'm going to take the arch from 590 to 630 feet. So each of those 2 buildings influenced each other.
Well, fascinating. We're going to take a little break now, John, but we come back. We're going to talk more about the Gateway Arch and Illustrated Timeline. Stay with us.
¿Qué color? Perfecto, mijo.
Gracias. Thank you.
What's wrong, mijo?
Donating to a pet's medical care is one of the many ways you can help families in your community. Pets and people belong together. Learn more at petsandpeopletogether.org.
What I love about St. Louis is the 79 unique neighborhoods nestled into 108 city parks, including Forest Park, which is actually larger than Central Park in New York, and of course, the beautiful Tower Grove Park where I'm at now. Oh, the St. Louis Blues. We've got the St. Louis Surge, 2-time WBCBL champions. We've got Harris Stowe, Wash U, St. Louis University, and of course, the 11-time World Series champion, St. Louis Cardinals. So come experience St. Louis.
Is it okay to call you Mom?
Of course you can.
residents love the St. Louis Zoo because it's free. There's a train, a carousel, opportunities to make new friends, and plenty of fun learning experiences with the animals 363 days a year. So come and experience St. Louis.
I'm Steve Potter. Welcome back to City Corner. John C. Guenther is our guest. He has a new book out, The Gateway Arch, an illustrated timeline. And John, just to kind of recap, it's not just about the arch itself, it's about everything in the decades and the centuries that led up to the arch.
Right. The Gateway Arch is such an iconic structure, and when you see it, you instinctively know it's a gateway structure.
In your book, you use the term connecting the dots. What do you mean by that?
Right. So I think it's really important. It's fascinating how history and the various events interconnect with one another. And so you go from one event to another, and had this event not happened, something entirely different might have happened. So it's fascinating to trace that line. But also you might think of the book as the historic foundations of the Gateway Arch as opposed to the structural foundations. And so as such, it allows one to gain a much deeper appreciation. We're all in awe of this structure. People are drawn up there, they want to touch it, and those precise corners and everything. But then when you realize all the thought that went into it, the history that it represents, the importance of St. Louis, the centrality of St. Louis, not only physically, but in our history of our nation, it all comes through with this book, and you can go to any date and begin to connect those dots.
Let's look at another image from the book.
Yes, this is a magnificent rendering by J. Henderson Barr. He produced so many renderings, one after another, to study the building design of this. It's glimmering in the sunlight. You'll note it's a triangular cross section. This was an idea that evolved later, and it's rising up out of the landscape.
And one point I want to make too, when I'm looking at this, comment on it. We think of it now. There's the museum. There are those beautiful grounds. Back in the beginning, it was sort of just the arch, and it really has been a long time for the rest of it to develop.
Absolutely. It wasn't until 1980 that the landscape was actually fully realized, and that's well after the topping out of 1965. I might point out also in this rendering, you can see buildings in the foreground. There's an idea for a museum here of American architecture, because they realized there was a lot of great architecture that was being removed. So the idea was to have some of the finest pieces or fragments of that architecture be exhibited here. I also would point out the landscape design, which was done by a very wonderful and talented landscape architect, Dan Kiley. And I had the great privilege of meeting Dan in the 90s when he came through St. Louis to see the arch grounds once more. And I'll never forget what he told me when he went to Eero Saarinen's office one morning when they were working on the Gateway Arch competition. And Eero said to him and the team, "We are not leaving today until we've accomplished something of great significance." And Dan said, "We knew we were in for an all-nighter."
Speaking of landscaping, tell me if I'm making this up. Seems to me I remember a long time ago, didn't they plant a bunch of trees there in the beginning they ended up taking down decades later because of a problem?
Right. Yes, I believe there was a sort of a disease that went through those trees. And so at any rate, Dan had specified a different type of tree than what was actually installed. But
let's look at another image.
Yeah, so this is the original. The design competition was done in two parts. So this was the first submission. And the important thing to note here is while you see a gateway arch, you see that it's actually a rectangular cross-section for the leg. It's not the triangular cross-section that we know. Also take note at how close it is to the riverfront. It's virtually on the levee. But one of the things that this did not take into account, and which they were not instructed to take into account, was the railroad, the trestle. And that trestle came back to impact the location of the Gateway Arch. And it's a good thing that it moved further uphill because of our flooding conditions. There was also to be a museum, and this museum is illustrated in these various vignettes just behind the arch. It was set into the hillside.
John, I want to mention that you are president of the St. Louis chapter of the Society of Architectural historians.
Yes, yes.
What's that all about?
Well, it's a group dedicated to celebrating and spreading the good word of the great architecture that we have here in St. Louis. So we have annual lecture series. We have 3 in the spring, 3 in the fall. We have our annual meetings as well. And but basically we are here to provide information about St. Louis architectural history.
And you also wrote something about like the 25 buildings to see in Missouri for
Yes.
USA Today?
Yes, yes. I began with Missouri Life magazine, where I wrote about 50 buildings, and then USA Today Online asked if we would take it to 25 and place that online with the American Institute of Architects. And so I had to, edit even further. But Missouri is blessed with so much great architecture that and this spans from north, south, east, west. So great architecture.
And nobody
all around.
tops St. Louis as far as bricks.
No,
right?
no, the home of brick architecture. Yes.
Right. Let's go to the next image.
This is a great diagram. This is of the tram system, and it was designed by Dick Bowser in 1960. He was referred to the Saarinen office. He and his father had an elevator company, the Bowser parking system. They would put cars on elevators and lift them up and then put them onto very elevated parking structures. And so when he was asked, could he design an elevator that didn't have to go straight up? He said, well, I think so. And so he actually had a whole 2 weeks to design the tram system. And he did it day and night working out of his house. And he was given the criteria, how many passengers per hour, per day, and so on and so forth. And he came up with the idea of these tram capsules. And they are a combination of both an elevator and a Ferris wheel. So they are hung from the supporting system, and they are pulled up, and it's a 155-degree turn as you go up the leg. And when you feel the cab sort of right itself, that's the Ferris wheel principle.
My favorite thing is to take somebody that's never been up to the arch, because you know the expression on their faces when they get in there?
Yeah. Very tight.
Yeah, it's quite an experience. Let's look at another one.
So here is a photograph of Eero Saarinen, and I referred to him trusting his eye and making models. And he would make he and his office would make very large scale models, so he could literally be inside the
And it
model.
wasn't always like this. Didn't it vary a little at first? It was not quite as rounded or something?
Right. So what you're looking at here is the later versions, and you see the triangular cross section. Early on, it was about 590 feet high and about 700 feet wide, so decidedly wider and shorter. And over time, it became more of a 590 by 591, and then 630 by 630 in terms of height and width. But the big contribution, and this is one of these moments in history that really changes history. Eero Saarinen was at Cranbrook Academy, where he and his father Elio, they were based, and Carl Milles was a Swedish sculptor in residence. Carl Milles passed by Eero's desk, saw the design with the rectangular cross-section for the legs, and said, Eero, that should be a triangle, not a rectangle. Huh. And Eero thought about it and accepted Carl Milles' idea, and that was put into the second stage competition. But it's amazing and wonderful that Carl Milles saw that, made that recommendation. Unfortunately, he did not get the credit he deserved.
There's one question that's always been in my mind, and you're an architect, so I have to ask you. I can't think of anything that was ever built that lasted forever except the pyramids. So ever since I was a little kid, I was wondering, the arch can't last forever.
Yeah.
Explain that to me.
Well, I mean, Eero designed for the ages and said it's for 1,000 years and beyond. It's made out of stainless steel, the outer skin, and the inner. It's a double skin.
But there must be a science to it that it's able to move, because if it wasn't flexible, it wouldn't last.
Right. It's an orthotropic design. It's a double skin. There's a stainless steel on the outside, carbon steel in the middle, in the inside, and then concrete and reinforcing. That comprises the double skin for the first 300 feet, and then the second, the remaining height up to 630 is a hollow double skin, and it was all calculated out, and it does have a little sway, a little give, as you would imagine, because you have wind forces, and I've been told I think in 90 miles an hour it will sway up to 18 inches.
So are you telling me it will last forever?
That's what I believe. I believe it is of the ages and for the ages. I will say also in terms of swaying, again, going back to those courageous workmen, I've heard stories from them that said they were caught up there in a quick storm before the pieces were connected, the legs were connected, and they said they were swaying quite violently. So.
Oof, wow. Let's look at some more images from the book, The Gateway Arch, an illustrated timeline.
Yes. So this shows you the land as it was around 1945. With 37 blocks cleared of over 400 buildings, and with the old courthouse, the old cathedral, and the old rock house, the three historic structures remaining. And notably, you see the trellis, the elevated train tracks going alongside the levee, and that was one of those key elements that had to be relocated prior to the arch even beginning. That was actually the first phase of the arch, was to relocate those tracks.
Do you think St. Louis would be different today if the arch had never happened?
Well, yes, probably so. Probably so. You can look at it in different ways. I mean, I think it would, the historic riverfront would have been reused and renovated and probably been quite dynamic space with new uses. So we know Laclede's Landing and how popular that was at its time. And that's a remnant of what we could have seen had it remained. That said, this is such an iconic structure and design, and it attracts millions of visitors each year. So for the positive, I'm delighted that we have this magnificent
You're doing
arch.
about 1 million book signings over the next few months. What kind of, I'm just wondering what people say to you.
Well, it's fascinating because you do hear stories of their remembrances of the arch and when they were growing up and so on. At the Arch store, at the Arch Museum there, I met a gentleman who said he actually physically walked up the leg of the arch.
I always wanted to do that.
And I was amazed to hear that. I was surprised.
Do they let people do that?
They don't. And so I was truly amazed. And I asked him how, when and how, because typically you need to go up in the capsule. Usually those steps are only there for emergency use, only for exiting. So that was one. But yes, people have fond memories of where they were when it was topped out and so on and so forth.
You refer to it in the book, you call the arch an icon of structural expressionism.
Yes.
So
yes.
can you explain that to me?
Okay, so it's a magnificent structure. It's sculptural, but it's expressive. That idea of the gateway to the west, that arch just soars so beautifully, and it's open and dynamic. So you get the sense of movement just intuitively. So it's both structural and expressionistic. So we combine those to say structural expressionism. So it's a beautifully resolved, one of the great works of architecture in the world. Anytime.
Mm-hmm. Well, it is the Gateway Arch, an illustrated timeline, and it's available just, I guess, everywhere books are sold, right?
Yes. Uh-huh.
And you have another, it's 3D Press, of course, which has been around.
Yep.
John C. Guenther is the author. He's an architect and a historian. And you have any other projects coming up?
Well, in terms of writing, I do want to carry on with a book called 75 Must-See Buildings in Missouri. So I want to expand that to share the architectural wealth of Missouri.
Well,
so, yeah.
John C. Guenther, thank you so much for taking the time to join us and talking about the most iconic symbol, I guess, of St. Louis ever.
Thank you so much.
It's
been a privilege.
And I'm going to remember this, that you say it's going to last forever.
Very good.
All right. John, thank you.
Thank
It's
you.
the Gateway Arch and Illustrated Timeline. I'm Steve Potter. Thanks for joining us today on City Corner. Bye.